long before the Raven Guard earned their reputation as masters of shadow and silence. Their story began amidst the flames of Terra's unification wars. One of their earliest recorded campaigns involves the nascent 19th taking part in the brutal conquest of the Central Asiatic region, a land that had been ruled by a tyrant known as Tekalagan of Ursh. Surviving records from that era are scarce, but fragments paint a picture that is no less grim than the situation that currently occupies the 40th millennium. The 19th Legion fought not as conquerors in shining armor, but rather as ghosts meandering throughout the wastelands. They infiltrated enemy lines long before the first formal strike ever occurred, with small surgical detachments who embedded themselves across the region, unseen and unacknowledged, awaiting the Emperor's word to strike. When the order finally came, it was swift and absolute. The attack shattered Ursha's forces with a clinical ruthlessness that made the Legion differ from its cousins, as Kagalan's warlords were executed in mere moments, and the Legion's foes left broken to attempt to gather the remnants of once mighty army, which were to be driven into sprawling prison camps beneath the skies of Central Asia. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. Kagalan's armies wielded weapons forged not merely of steel and fire, but of mind. Sacker-wrought horrors were unleashed upon the Emperor's warriors, and it was the 19th that bore the brunt of this assault. Many who survived spoke no more of what they had seen. Some fell into a clinical despair as their minds fractured beyond repair, while others, burned out in self-terminating charges, embraced death with the same cold precision that once had defined their service. It was amongst these haunted survivors that the earliest of the Majoritas emerged, lone killers consumed by their own darkness, fighting as if every battle was their last. With Ursha destroyed, the Emperor's light moved onwards, and the 19th Legion, now blooded and honored, was assigned operations all across the Sol system. Their next task would mark them forever, as the battle would be fierce. This was the purging of the Xenos-held settlements of the Genovian range, with the moon of Lycia at their back. Of this campaign, even the Mechanicum's vaults and vast records yield little. What reports do exist speak of a complete victory, so utter and all-consuming that the alien threat was deemed truly annihilated, but at a cost that defied understanding. Every human colony on the world was found dead, and their settlements reduced to silence. Even amongst the Legion, the losses were catastrophic. Those who survived were equally recalled to the Emperor's gene forges. What they witnessed, or perhaps more likely what they became, remains one of the greatest unanswered questions of the Unification era. No similar withdrawal of legionaries ever occurred, even with the more divergent strains, such as the Space Wolves or the Blood Angels, or as they were known at the time, the Revenant Legion. In the later decades, survivors of the Lastian campaign bore a single haunting emblem on their armor, the ancient Jovian rune, crowned with a numerical 19, as a grim marker of their victory purchased in blood. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, that symbol could be seen upon the armored hulls of most of the Legion's dreadnoughts. Amongst them, Shade Captain Vaholst, a hero of the Jovian range, mortally wounded in that long-forgotten war, was interned within the sarcophagus of a mighty Fubrins-class dreadnought, within which he would continue to serve for galactic decades, leading the Raven Guard into battle time and time again, until his final breath was drawn in the shattered defenses of Gate 42. He was a warrior entombed from a legion scarred, with a legacy written in silence. The shadows of the Unification War still echo and linger within the Raven Guard's very DNA. Whispers of what was won and what was lost in the Emperor's relentless march towards unity still reverberate throughout the Raven Guard and their successors to this day. In the twilight of the Unification Wars, as Terra's final tyrants fell beneath the Emperor's thunder, the 19th Legion was officially born, and christened as one of the last legions of the Legiones Astartes to take full shape. Forged in the fires of what is seen as genetic perfection, its warriors were drawn from the savage tribes of the Asiatic dustfields, men molded by desolation, bred for endurance and silence in war. Yet, unlike many of their other brother legions, the 19th would wait nearly for 2 full centuries before reuniting with their Primarch. By contrast, the 16th Legion, known as the Luna Wolves, found their gene sire rather early, Horus Lupercal, the man who was first discovered at least by what open records state, and who was known as the first and favored son of the Emperor, would predate the Raven Guard's meeting with their own Primarch by centuries. It was not uncommon that the Luna Wolves and the Raven Guard fought side by side in the early conquests of Old Earth and within the Sol System. The synergy between these two legions seemed almost as if it were by design, and when Horus unleashed lightning assault, striking with a terrifying accuracy, the warriors of the 19th were already in place, unseen and unheralded, waiting to cut off escape routes and disrupt communication and logistical lines, ensuring that no foe ever survived or was able to mount a proper resistance. Those who tried to flee found themselves trapped by shadows, cornered, disarmed, and herded beneath the cold, dead eyes of the raven-blooded warriors, until their leaders bent the knee to the imperial truth. Members of the 19th did not speak much, but rather they would watch, judge, and when ordered, strike with a frightening self-control that unnerved many within Imperial command. Amongst rebels and tyrants alike, the name of the 19th Legion became synonymous with a quiet doom that would let them speak nevermore. When the Great Crusade began in earnest, Horus Lupercal often requested their presence, as he trusted the 19th implicitly, for they required neither glory nor recognition. In the words of one rememberer, they were ghosts of the Emperor's making, there before the command, and gone before the praise. World after world would be brought into compliance. Some resisted longer than others. Their governments dissolved under fire and blade. Others accepted the imperial creed with grace. For the latter, the 19th remained unseen, their blades sheathed before they were ever drawn. Such was their art, to strike without warning and to vanish without a trace. Over time, Horus came to regard the 19th as almost an extension of his own legion, a tool so efficient and so well integrated into his own tactics that it seemed purpose-built for his campaigns and his alone. His Luna Wolves swelled with recruits from the underworlds of Chthoniya, their discipline laced with the rough-edged culture of the gangs and loyalties of his own world. The 19th, however, remained few in number, reserved, insular, and distinctly Terran in spirit. They were not brothers to the Luna Wolves, but rather their shadow, an extension of his legion, in all but name. While the Luna Wolves deployed their own proud iconography, the 19th Legion retained their stark austerity. Their armor stayed gunmetal gray, and their heraldry was sparse and nearly unseen. Before battle, many amongst them painted their faces with the fine dust of their birthlands, burnt sands of the Xeric wastes, creating a ghostly visage that unnerved even their allies. The Luna Wolves, half in jest and half in respect, gave them titles such as the Pale Nomads, the Dusk-clad. Both titles spoke to their nature, wanderers of the wastelands, draped in silence and ash. But there were deeper, stronger, stranger traits as well. Under the influence of their gene seed, some legionaries grew pallid, as their skin turned near alabaster white beneath the unfiltered sun of conquered worlds. Others found their dark hair deepening to an almost reflective Vanta black, and in rare instances, too rare to be a coincidence, yet too frequent to ignore, their eyes darkened entirely, as not only their pupil, but their iris and their sclera became voids of onyx, deeply set within their pale faces. These mutations gave them a grim countenance, one that spoke of death long before a shot was fired. None could have foreseen it, but those features were the first signs of something greater, the nearing of the shadow of their lost Primarch, waiting just slightly beyond the stars. In time, those traits would come to define them completely. But for now, in the long wars of unification and conquest, the 19th Legion stood apart, cold, watchful, and ever patient. Always in the company of the wolves, but always moving in their shadow. Before they ever found their Primarch, the warriors of the 19th Legion had already fought for more than a century continuously of unending wars. In that time, they became something of a silent extension of the Luna Wolves. That we know, as they operated under the banner of Horus Lupercal. Their victories, though vital, were often hidden beneath the margins of official records. To the order of the remembrancers, their deeds were ghostly, their triumphs footnotes beneath the glories of others. Yet those unseen battles shaped the Imperium's earliest conquest, none more so than the grim campaign now remembered as the Battle of Hell's Anvil. Hell's Anvil was not a poetic name, it was a title given by the Imperial Strategos to a fortress so vast and unyielding that it seemed forged from the bones of the very planet itself. Located deep within the sunken metropoli of Bartigum, the fortress was a seat of the world masters, once humans who had long since been corrupted by centuries upon centuries of cybernetic augmentation and techno-slavery. The Imperial Army struggled for nearly 5 years to bring the singular city into compliance, but each attempt ended in bloody ruin. Every approach swallowed by the labyrinthian depths of the planet's industrial waste. Tens of thousands already perished when the Emperor's command fell to the 19th Legion, as 3 full chapter detachments of the 19th arrived, under the command of Shade Lord Arkar's Fall, the master of the Legion. At his side came a contingent of Luna Wolves, warriors chosen by Horus Lupercal himself, sent to ensure the fortress would finally fall, and that at least in part his name would be upon the victory. What followed would be a mark of both victory and infamy. Without hesitation, strike cruisers of the 19th Legion began orbital bombardment directly above Hell's Anvil and its subsurface bastions. The assault was merciless, as concussive storms of plasma and macro shells tore through the strata and rock, along with the steel that was used to reinforce these underground bunkers. The bombardment tectonic forces rattled the Barbatum to its molten heart, collapsing entire city blocks and reducing hab complexes to slag. Civilian casualties were deemed as acceptable losses, as the Emperor's will, after all, demanded compliance, not mercy. When the bombardment ceased, Thal ordered the assault to begin proper. But in a cold, calculated move, it was not the Space Marines who would strike first. Instead, he sent forwards regiments of the Thorasian Voltigars, mortal soldiers of the Imperial Army, to lead the vanguard of the assault against the now shattered gateworks. Within minutes, the mortals were engulfed as hundreds of thousands of worker drones, the mindless, screaming remnants of the world population, poured from the breach in an avalanche of flesh melded to steel. Cut off and dying by the thousands, the Thorasians' pleas for reinforcements echoed unanswered throughout the Vox channels. For hours they fought alone, creating a living wall of blood and desperation to hold back the ocean of cybernetic madness. And still the 19th did not move. Only when Hell's Anvil had been emptied of its defenders into the kingdom's ground did the Shade Lord give the order. The 19th Legion and their Luna Wolves allies descended, not in rescue, but as an execution force. Leading their way was headhunter companies of the Ashen Claw chapter, commanded by Shade Captain Kirin. As they cut their way into the fortress's hollow core, hacking through the last of the overseers and their machine slaves with a brutality that they'd grown oh so accustomed to displaying, it left hours of brutal tunnel fighting to go. As they reached the heart of the fortress, the chamber was now dominated by titanic plasma reactors whose power could have lit the continent perpetually. It was there that the Legion discovered the largest of the Barbatian overseers, a monstrous hybrid of both steel and flesh. Their battle was short yet devastating. When the beast finally fell, Kirian's warriors planted melta charges throughout the reactor's entire containment systems and withdrew in silence. Moments later, the charges detonated, reducing Hell's Anvil to molten ruin. On the surface, Shade Lord's Fall's forces had already cleansed the last of the worker drones. In the aftermath of this event, the resistance of Barbratium collapsed in its entirety. Despite the devastation, the envoys of the Mechanicum were quick to claim victory. Within months, the production facilities within the world resumed their work, as the planet's material veins once again would begin feeding humanity's forges, and those would be that of the nascent Imperium. Yet the cost was staggering, as the Thorasian Voltigazers had lost over 100,000 soldiers in less than a day. In comparison, the Space Marines of the 19th Legion and the Luna Wolves had only suffered a few hundred casualties, most of them amongst the Ashen Claws. To these strategos of the Great Crusade, it was a pragmatic exchange, a necessary sacrifice for victory. But amongst those who fought beside them, this was a darker lesson. When the 19th Legion joined a campaign, survival was not guaranteed, nor was it possible to actually rely on their aid. The legend of Hell's Anvil would echo for decades, staining the reputation of the 19th Legion in a way they could never wash away. Their methods, efficient, ruthless, unflinching, and calculatingly pragmatic, mirrored the merciless practices of their ancestors, where survival was not a guarantee for anyone who fought within their shadows. The legend of Hell's Anvil would indeed echo for decades, but that would come to an end when at last Corvus Corax was found and reunited with his sons. His presence alone would suppress the legacy that his sons had built up with quiet fury. The Raven Lord had no place for cruelty born of conquest. In the years that followed, such methods would fade into silence, forgotten both within and beyond the Legion. But the memory of Hell's Anvil remained as a shadowed chapter in the 19th Legion's history, whispered within the archives of the Imperial vaults, but never spoken aloud by those who survived it. Now, the story of Corvus Corax itself begins in both tragedy and secrecy. Like all of his brothers, as an infant he was torn from the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra by a combination of the ruinous powers and the literal worst mother in history, throwing her sons into literal space hell without a plan, allowing the gods of the warp to violate the wards placed upon the gene forges themselves, letting them in part seize the infant Primarchs and cast them away, including Korax, across the galaxy, who himself was flung through the void of the warp, leading to him eventually being discovered in the lightless chamber far beneath the surface of a barren moon known as Lycris. This was a desolate, airless satellite of an industrial planet known as Kyvar. At this time, Kyvar was a technological marvel, a forge world whose city-sized manufactura drew upon the mineral wealth of its moons through the ruthless labor of its enslaved populations. Lycris was in essence a lifeless rock with a thin crust and vast subterranean galaxies, and it might have remained forever unvisited were it not for a team of miners pursuing a newly discovered mineral seam. The timing of it was uncanny, as within solar minutes of Korax attaining consciousness, the miners themselves stumbled upon him. Some speculated that this was an intervention far less accidental than it would seem, hinting at powers unseen by mortal eyes guiding the events of the galaxy. The infant Primarch was taken in by the enslaved population of Lythris and hidden from the scrutiny of Kyvar's overseers. These slaves were no mere laborers, as many were criminals, political dissidents, or even workers who had failed their quotas. This was a population hardened by oppression and accustomed to brutality, possessing cunning born of survival. To them, Korax was a gift of fate, a child whose extraordinary presence spoke of the possibility for salvation, and they named him, in their tongue, Deliverer, anticipating the deeds that they believed he would one day enact. From the earliest days of his life, Korax matured at a supernatural pace. Though he was created with vast knowledge already imprinted in his mind, he required guidance to understand the subtleties of humanity, loyalty, and strategy. His mentors were those brave men and women who had survived the cruel regime of Kyvar, and they imparted onto him lessons in patience, observation, and cunning. They taught him the necessity of biding one's time, of striking only when the hour was right, and of using the gifts of his body and mind to plan far into the future. It was in these formative years that Korax discovered the full extent of his abilities. Moving in the shadows of his captors, he became unseen in ways that defied explanation. Even when in plain sight, he could will himself to be ignored, becoming a literal phantom amongst prisoners and overseers alike. Only the most advanced aspects or artificial detection systems could perceive him. But instead of the entirety of his being, they revealed a strange property, as the mind of their observer could be deceived and tricked into overlooking his presence when he willed it so. Yet he was still there and undisguised in any way, shape, or form. This uncanny skill would later define the tactics that his legion would bear. As Korax matured, the tyranny of Kyvar's tech guides drew to an inexorable close. Though the overseers remained oblivious until their doom was inevitable, Korax would lead a cadre of freedom fighters as he orchestrated a campaign of precision strikes where he sabotaged life and power systems alongside stealing mass amounts of weaponry, ambushing key patrols, and carefully manipulating the prison's chain of command. Each action was calculated, drawing the overseers ever closer to the moment of collapse. Then the day came when Korax would unleash the full might of his rebellion, in a bloody, meticulously planned uprising. The prison population of Lycrus rose against its oppressors. The fighting itself was merciless, with many prisoners having been hardened criminals, and the Primarch was even forced into direct combat, as he imposed a strict order which they followed to a letter. And he even went as far as to impose strict conditions that they would become free, as long as they could never repeat the acts that had got them imprisoned in the first place. By the end of the struggle, Lycrus had been liberated, and the small moon had finally been freed from centuries of oppression. It was in the immediate aftermath of this victory, as atomic bombardments rained down upon Kaivar itself, that the Emperor arrived to reclaim his lost son. The convergence of events was near mythic. A Primarch nurtured in the shadows of slavery, a meticulously planned insurrection, and a father returned to claim a son who had already proven himself a savior. Corax's journey from captive to liberator would shape not only the future of the 19th Legion, but the very methods and ideals that would define the Raven Guard and their successors in the wars to come. Unlike many of the chronicled reunions of the Great Crusade, the meeting between the Emperor and Corvus Corax was a singular incident in its intimacy. The Master of Mankind arrived alone upon Lycrus and departed the following solar days in the same solitude. What was said during those long hours remains cloaked in uncertainty. Imperial historians have speculated endlessly, postulating that perhaps the Emperor spoke of the fragile nature of humanity, of the other Primarchs, yet unready to grasp the truths beyond mortal comprehension, or the insidious forces that simmer within the warp, shadows that would soon engulf the galaxy in flame. Some accounts suggest that Corax was forewarned in part of the betrayal that would soon come from the War Master, Horus. If so, he was careful to reveal that knowledge in only measured doses, passing it on to warriors when the moment demanded. One certainty emerges from every single record. The Emperor left Corax to complete his mission independently, entrusting him with both the liberation of Kadavar and the wisdom to govern his legion. This decision, some scholars claim, was deliberate, as the Emperor was ensuring that his son learned the harshest of lessons from war firsthand, absorbing the weight of command, strategy, and consequence without direct intervention. Corax's armament was improvisational, as it was culled from the hidden stockpiles the tech guilds had accumulated on Lycrus throughout centuries, confident that no enslaved population would ever claim such devastating tools. Amongst these were atomic charges and mining munitions, weapons of mass destruction laying dormant beneath the enslaved moon's very surface. The Primarch, however, turned these tools of oppression into instruments of liberation. When Kadavar tech guilds launched a desperate counteroffensive against the numerically inferior freedom fighters, Corax made the terrible decision to unleash the atomic arsenal he had stockpiled. From his vantage point, he directed a precise bombardment across the manufactura cities of Kadavar, devastating the infrastructure that had long enslaved his people. Tens of thousands perished beneath the fires, yet Corax understood the calculus of survival. By destroying these centers of tyranny, countless of millions across the Imperium would be spared further suffering. It was a lesson the Emperor had intended him to learn, a lesson in the grim arithmetic of war that few but the Primarchs could ever fully comprehend. In the aftermath, the Cadaverian tech guilds capitulated, and Lycrus received its freedom. Further still, in recognition of its deliverance, was renamed Deliverance by its grateful inhabitants. The planet's people had witnessed a profound demonstration that sometimes the innocent must endure catastrophe so that the greater good may be secured. This brutal insight would shape Corax's doctrine and temper the Raven Guard's ethos for millennia to come. With Lycrus secured, the Mechanicum intervened in order to restore the ruined colony into a world that was productive in its youth. The Black Tower that had once overseen the oppression of the slaves stood, now transformed and renamed, into the Ravenspire, becoming the very fortress monastery of the newly christened Raven Guard Legion, a symbol of vengeance, liberation, and a calculated show of death that would define the Legion evermore. From that day forward, the Raven Guard not only bore the mark of their Primarch, but the lessons heavily learned through their combat in Deliverance, shaping the Legion that would walk unseen, strike swiftly, and act with cold, deliberate precision, learned under the fire, and forged with the weight of necessity bearing down upon them. By 922 M31, when the Raven Lord assumed official command of his legion, the Great Crusade was already more than a century in span. Corvus Corax then wasted no time in imposing the doctrines of Lycurgus upon the 19th Legion, blending lethal precision, stealth, rapid mobility, and calculated guile with the vigilance that the Raven Guard had known for millennia. It was during these early years under Corax's guidance that the Legion underwent profound cultural recalibration. The cold-blooded tendencies inherited from the Xeric tribes of old Earth, once the hallmark of the Legion, were ruthlessly excised and expunged. Many of the senior leadership and officers of the Legion, veterans of decades-long campaigns of oppression, occupation, and enforcement, were reassigned to non-command positions. Amongst them was one Lord Akaris Fall, who had held the command of the 19th Legion and functioned as its Legion Master for 30 solar cycles. Corax's reforms were not merely administrative, but philosophical as well, redefining the Legion's ethos to reflect vigilance tempered with purpose, rather than cruelty born of habit. The Raven Guard's tactical acumen quickly reached unprecedented levels. Corax is recorded as having bested Rebut Guilliman in his brother Primarchs Regius Strategio Simulacrum, deploying unconventional troop types that Guilliman had never encountered before, including the precursors of the Moritas. Corax prevailed 3 times in these trials. However, it must be noted that once Guilliman adapted, the Raven Lord could never again triumph over him. This incident underscores both the ingenuity and the limits of the Legion, illustrating how Corax's unique upbringing had forged a commander capable of exploiting the unseen. Under Corax, the Raven Guard pioneered technological innovations that would define their style of warfare. The Forges of Mars would be commissioned with modifications to standard Thunderhawk gunships, producing the Shadowhawk, equipped with technologies designed to evade detection by all but the most sensitive of augurs. Equally remarkable was the Whisper Cutter, an open-air gravitic flyer capable of delivering 10 fully equipped legionaries deep into a combat zone in complete silence, a veritable testament to the Legion's emphasis on clandestine operations. These achievements were not of Martian design alone, as artificers of Kedavar, formerly bound to the planet's tech guilds, lent their expertise to the Raven Guard, creating systems and devices unknown to the mainstream Mechanicum. However, over time, the Legion's tech marines would be initiated into these secretive arts, thereby ensuring the Mechanicum would glean some amount of this information, and ensuring that the Raven Guard possessed the capabilities that were both unique and highly classified, allowing them to operate in a manner distinct to all other legions, with the potential exception of the Alpha Legion. Some go so far as to speculate that without Corax's patronage, these artificers might have been declared outcasts by the jealous lords of Mars, yet their loyalty to the Legion preserved their independence. Kedavar, having endured the Age of Strife, assumed a place within the Imperium that was higher than most other worlds directly under the Primarch's control. Its output, though modest, was comparable to a full Forge world, making it nonetheless vital. With the guidance of Mars's tech priests, Kedavar produced specialized weaponry and machinery for the Raven Guard exclusively, maintaining a greater degree of autonomy than most Mechanicum worlds could claim. It must also be noted that the planet's artificers jealously guarded their secrets, recognizing the authority of the Raven Guard above all others, causing no small amount of friction between them and the Mechanicum as a whole. Of all the Mechanicum's ancient subordinate domains, Kedavar maintained relations with only one other, Galphion 4. Though the precise terms of this relationship are mostly lost to history, the repeated presence of the Legio Gryphonic's Titan Crusade would leave indelible marks upon Titans alongside the Raven Guard in large-scale operations suggests a reciprocal accord, a pact that may still exist in some form, shrouded in no small amount of secrecy, much like almost everything else the Raven Guard has ever done. In this way, under Corax's command, the Raven Guard became a legion transformed, one that was precise, unrelentingly lethal, yet tempered by consciousness and the tactical lessons learned from Deliverance. Their shadowed path through the Great Crusade may have left them marked, but discovering their Primarch, turned them into something more, something greater than they could have ever been without him. And throughout their history, though often overlooked, it was their silent hand that shaped countless victories in unseen battles across the void. The conquest of Carnae Solitatus is one of these such victories. However, it is a darker episode within the history of the Raven Guard, a campaign whose full details had been long suppressed by the Officio Militaris. It is a story that shows both the brilliance and the ruthlessness that defined the Legion under Corvus Corax's control as the task force arrived in the Carnae system with nearly 30,000 legionaries, supported by twice that number of Imperial Army soldiers. Their objective was the Thousand Moons of Carnae, an immense series of void cities orbiting a planetless primary remains of an age-long past when mankind's reach had been far less complete. These cities were governed by isolationist rulers who had no inclination to bend the knee to the Emperor. Here, Corax's tactical genius became a weapon manifest, rather than an assault throughout the entirety of the system, all at once, or engaging the combined massed fleet of Solemnity. In a drawn-out space engagement, the Raven Guard struck moon by moon, exploiting the isolation of each of these satellite cities. Every void city was formidable on its own, nigh impenetrable when together. However, their own independent strength proved a fatal vulnerability when severed from aid of its neighbors. This approach allowed the Legion to advance with precision, striking swiftly before any fully concise defense could be mounted, often before the enemy had even realized that they were under assault. The campaign, however, would take a horrific turn on Zenith 312, as the combined Imperial forces prepared a coordinated assault on the city's arch-controller, Agrith, who would unleash a weapon of ancient design, preserved in stasis since the Age of Strife, an anima phage of immense potency. The weapon transformed citizens and Imperial Army soldiers alike into a mindless, frothing horde, bereft of all reason or memory, their numbers swelling into the tens of thousands, their strength magnified by lunacy. However, fortunately for Corax, the Raven Guard were relatively impervious to such an arcane plague, yet they were confronted with a dire choice. To allow the infected to live would have risked total chaos and further loss of life across the system, leading them to a cold, merciless choice. The 19th Legion would purge every last living thing within the Void City, cutting down friend and foe alike, granting victims the mercy of death. In the aftermath, it was discovered that the Arch-Comptroller Agrath had used the chaos to escape aboard his personal shuttle, leaving the city to burn and the survivors to perish. The Raven Lord, incensed by this tragedy, shifted the Legion's focus from conquest to vengeance. Moritat kill teams were deployed in order to hunt Agrath across the outer reaches of the Crane system, tracking him to a remote outpost drifting perilously closely to the star's corona. The Mortas executed their grim task, moving silently, methodically, leaving a trail of bodies piled up in their wake, erasing every chance of escape and ensuring that every path through the station was turned into a death corridor. They would make no effort to capture the Arch-Controller, as they systematically destroyed all the station's transport save one to prevent further flight. The sun's fiery embrace would eventually consume the outpost for over 4 hours, and Corax stood watch, listening to Angrath's final screams over an open Vox channel. The Arch-Controller raged, blistered, and finally pleaded for his life before being silenced by the molten collapse of his station. In this act, the Raven Guard extracted their vengeance and avenged the innocent citizens of Zenith 312. Yet this retribution came at a cost. The Imperial Army and Crusade fleet, deprived of the 19th Legion support in subsequent engagements, suffered uncountable heavy losses. What should have been a swift, methodical conquest of the Crane systems instead dragged on for almost a total of 7 solar months, with thousands upon thousands of more lives lost as the Legion pursued their single-minded justice. The Crane campaign thus became a testament to the duality of Corax's leadership, a brilliant, calculating, and inexorably lethal one, yet capable of imposing consequences that would reverberate on both sides, across entire fleets and systems. On the world of Fraternitas Maximus, the 19th Legion undertook a mission that would forever be recorded as a rite of annihilation. This would be the eradication of Bergshi, a highly dangerous hostile xenospecies of insectoid design that evolved in isolation on the very planet Fraternus Maximus. As a detachment of Raven Guard operating alongside the Night Lords entered this creature's territory under the command of Sergeant Davrian Kaid, the infiltration team's objectives was simple: collapse the Bergsheik hive and everything under it, thereby neutralizing its threat. Yet the mission quickly became a testament to the perils inherent in such operations, as the detachment was quickly discovered and all but Cade were slaughtered. Severely maimed and having lost one arm alongside both legs, Cade nonetheless succeeded in dragging himself across hostile territory, reaching Imperial lines through sheer determination and willpower. His endurance earned him the moniker the Carry-On. This title was bestowed by the observing Night Lords. The Raven Guard ensured he underwent extensive augmetic repairs, eventually selecting him for training as a tech marine on Mars in order to get him even greater prosthetics. This would have him set on a path that would make him a pivotal player in the later Schism of Mars. Nearly 50 standard years later, the Raven Guard turned their full attention to Indra Sui, discovered during their operations on the northern reaches of the galaxy. The campaign, undertaken almost 50 years after Corax had resumed command of the Legion, illustrates the melding of Deliverance-born insurgents and the brutal raiders of Terra's Asiatic dustfields into the doctrine of the now reforged Raven Guard. The planet itself, once a thriving explorator port of the Dark Age of technology, now lay in ruin, a veritable wasteland dominated by vast silver spires, many kilometers thick, its upper branches extending into orbit like skeletal tendrils. Within its monolithic structures, the remnants of the planet's population were held, twisted by centuries of oppression under Xenos horror known as the Crave. Corax, recalling the liberation of Deliverance, refused to countenance mass extermination, despite advice from his Terran-born captains to deploy nerve phage gas to simultaneously destroy both Xenos and enslaved humans. He devised a plan of precision, operating to save as many as possible while minimizing collateral loss. Less than 2,000 legionaries drawn from reconnaissance and infiltration companies were selected to execute this operation. The insertion was made at the Spire's midpoint via specially modified Shadowhawks and Darkwing gunship. This was a maneuver that required flawless coordination and absolute stealth. Within the Spire, the Raven Guard were confronted with the grim reality of centuries of suffering. Human survivors were malformed, packed into chambers in conditions more suitable for livestock than any sentient being. This was something that even the orcs might find appalling, as the Crave themselves were colossal corrupted beings, mutated by centuries of feeding on their captives, and augmented by foul warp glamours, rendering them nearly unstoppable in raw strength. The legionaries of Deliverance instinctively returned to their guerrilla doctrines, honed under Corax's tutelage, striking with precision, sowing confusion and isolating targets before delivering the final death nail. The hibernating Crave began to awaken at this moment, as the Raven Guard executed a tactical withdrawal, while Corax and a demi-company of Deliverance veterans provided a near-surgical rearguard. The remainder of the insertion team was deployed via teleport beacon rays, ensuring extraction of all forces before the annihilation was inevitable, but not prior to dealing sufficient damage. The battle's climax came when the arrival of the Deliverers, a company of Terran-born Raven Guard clad in Terminator armor, whose overwhelming firepower crushed the remaining Xenos resistance. Within hours, the Spire had been cleansed, and Indra Sui secured as a forward operating base for the Great Crusade's expansion into the Ghoul Stars. Yet even as this victory was assured, there would be grim consequences. Unknown to the Raven Guard, surviving humans were later commanded by the Imperium's iterators and other survivors to a life of servitude as tech servitors, due to being seen as irredeemably corrupted. The extent of this tragedy remained hidden from Corax, whose sense of justice and loyalty to innocence under his protection would likely have incited a campaign of vengeance and destabilized the Imperium's ever-expanding front lines. The world of Isstvan III would be brought into compliance by the 27th Imperial Expeditionary Fleet, commanded by the Primarch Corvus Corax, some 15 standard years before the infamous Dropsite Massacre that would scar the Imperium during the Horus Heresy. This planet presented a unique challenge, as the Isstvannians were a sophisticated and independent people, maintaining a largely cohesive industrialized society that endured intact through millennia of isolation. Scout vessels had confirmed that these humans had not only survived but flourished, making the Isstvan system a strategic prize for the Imperium, rich in resources, population, and industrial capacity. Long-standing autotechnocratic culture prevailed on Isstvan III, one steeped in local mysticism and entrenched in religious practice. When first contacted by the forerunners of the Great Crusade, the Isstvannians initially demurred and eventually outright rejected compliance of imperial truth, demonstrating both pride and resilience. The Imperial War Council, recognizing the value of the system, issued Corax a directive, bringing the world into compliance, but without the use of overwhelming force, so to preserve the planet's infrastructure and population. The responsibility subsequently fell to Corax and the Raven Guard, whose legion were renowned for surgical precision, and the execution of this directive would necessitate low-casualty operations. Their black-hulled strike cruisers and gunships descended upon Isstvan III without warning, targeting the planet's military infrastructure and seizing control of the key seats of governance. Despite the technological might and superior prowess of the transhuman space marines, the indigenous forces, professional soldiers, and highly trained psychers known as war singers resisted fiercely. It was only in the Rad Death Valley, after carefully orchestrated engagements, that the last pockets of aggressive resistance were eliminated by the Raven Guard. In the aftermath, an Isstvan delegation formally surrendered to Primarch Corvus Corax, and a full complement of 19th Legion, around 800 companies, numbering 80,000 Marines, reinforced by the Theron cohorts and the battle titans of Legio Vindicatum and Legio Adamantus, were present upon the surrender. The Isstvannians knelt before the sable-armored conquerors, defeated, yet recognized as fully human, and were quickly welcomed and integrated into the Imperium. Though they had fought bitterly amongst themselves and against the invaders, the imperial truth prevailed, and the Isstvannians swore to uphold its teachings by demonstrating wisdom and capacity for self-governance under the imperial guidance. They were deemed as suitable partners for integration within the Imperium's broader planetary network. At this time, the Remembrancer Order had not been imposed on Space Marine legions by the Council of Terra. Nevertheless, a substantial civilian contingent remained and began integration upon Isstvan into the administrative, cultural, and religious frameworks demanded by the Imperium. Benedus Paul was appointed as the Imperial Planetary Governor for this task, as he was deemed as competent enough to enforce compliance, overseeing the dismantling of the entrenched religious structures, including the Chaos faith dedicated to the worship of Slaanesh that had seemingly been on the planet, and ensuring loyalty to the Imperium. The established capital of Bank, known in Imperial Gothic as the Coral City, was selected as the locus of imperial power. Its sprawling proto-hive offered both strategic advantages and infrastructure to support governance and occupation. Unbeknownst to Corax and his Raven Guard at the time, this campaign was merely a prelude to the events 15 standard years in the future. The return to the Isstvan system, this time the world of Isstvan V, where the Primarch would confront the treachery of Horus and the shadow that would descend upon the Imperium. The Battle of Gate 42 would later stand as one of the greatest setbacks in the history of the 19th Legion, and a mere prelude to what would befall the Raven Guard on Isstvan V. This would occur only a few standard years prior to the Horus Heresy, in the wake of the triumph of Ulnar, when Horus Lupercal was elevated to the rank of War Master. In 000 M31, the Raven Guard were recalled from operations along the chord edge of the Ghoul Stars. They were then ordered to take their place in line alongside several other legions under Horus's direct command, charged with retaking the Akum Sloth cluster. Though initially brought to compliance by the Luna Wolves in the early years of the Great Crusade, the cluster had rebelled in an unprecedented fashion. The population had succumbed to a mass form of psychosis, later determined to have been caused by Xenos parasites. These parasitic entities matured within the eye sockets of their hosts, gradually taking rudimentary control and forming a collective. alien gestalt focus on a cabal of primary hosts known as the Unseen Kings. Horus, unwilling to see these worlds slip from the Imperium's grasp, vowed an oath of moment to reclaim them, no matter the cost. His strategy relied on rapid strikes to eliminate the Unseen Kings, preserve the cluster's vital infrastructure, and to showcase the merit of his new rank to his brother Primarchs. The plan called for a combined assault of the massed might of 4 legions. The Luna Wolves, the Space Wolves, the Iron Warriors, and the Raven Guard were all to converge on the heavily fortified lair of the Unseen Kings before launching a final overwhelming assault. Corvus Corax, however, opposed the War Master's strategy, recognizing the needless loss of his warriors. He proposed a campaign of feints and diversionary strikes, drawing the defenders away from the main assault, so that the remaining legions could breach the walls with greater ease. This drew accusation from Peterabo, who denounced the Raven Lord's caution as a dereliction of duty, nearly culminating in a duel between 2 Primarchs. Only the intervention of Leman Russ prevented any bloodshed, as he urged Corax to temper his bitterness and channel it into fire necessary to achieve the objectives at Gate 42. As the battle commenced, Corax mustered the Raven Guard before the gate. Many were Terran-dominated companies, noted for their tenacity and willingness to bear the brunt of Horus's plan, and they would be assigned to the vanguard. Their assault was without mercy. The gate's defenders, empowered by the Xenos influence, unleashed devastating firepower with a greater precision than normal humans could manage. At the height of the engagement, the assault companies were decimated, and the attack began to falter. In a desperate act of leadership, Corvus led a forlorn hope, personally spearheading the breach. His battle cry ignited the courage of his legionaries, and the walls of Gate 42 fell. The legion pressed through in a brutal advance, yet the ultimate honor of slaying the unsighted kings was claimed by Horus, who oversaw their execution. At that moment, the Xenos hold over the population dissipated, and the Akam Sos cluster was returned to Imperial control. The cost of this, however, was staggering. Countless of millions of hosts were crippled in mind and body, and thousands of Raven Guard, predominantly the Terran-born veterans who had fought alongside the Emperor and served under Horus for many a year, had perished beneath the shattered walls of the gate. The legion itself was left severely depleted, reduced to a total of only 80,000 legionaries, making it the smallest of all the legions Astartes. Corax, embittered by this needless loss and the War Master's insistence, removed his legion from Horus's command, swearing to never serve alongside him again. In the aftermath of the deaths of the Terran line officers, many of whom had served under Horus before Corax's arrival, this schism would further. This meant that the War Master unintentionally removed any significant influence he ever had over the Raven Guard, which would cost him severely during the Horus heresy, as he could have potentially swayed many within the Legion to join his side over their Primarch. Some detractors later claimed that Corax, by assigning these Terran-born companies to the most perilous positions, sought to consolidate his own authority, shaping the Legion to follow his vision and his vision alone, safeguarding it from the insidious influences of the warrior lodges that would later sow rebellion within other legions. Thus, while the Battle of Gate 42 was technically a victory, it marked the beginning of a bitter legacy, and it was a testament to the ferocity and discipline of the 19th Legion, but also a somber prelude to the tragedy and betrayal that would occur on Isfahan 5. Following this would be the Skull campaign, which unfolded over 2 standard years in a sector of space long claimed by the remnants of the shattered Eldari species. Beyond the immediate strategic goal of securing these worlds for the Imperium, the campaign would become a critical proving ground for the first 1,000 sets of prototype Space Marine armor crafted by the Mechanicum, armor that would later become immortalized as the Mark VI Corvus pattern armor, though at the time it carried the provisional designation of Mark V. Prior to the campaign, small numbers of this new armor had been trialed by the Iron Warriors and the Salamanders. Both legions expressed reservations regarding the armor's comparatively light plating, noting that it reduced protection against heavy assaults in contrast with the earlier marks. They pressed for a heavier design, prompting the Mechanicum to seek a large-scaled field trial before committing the armor to widespread deployment. The task of conducting said trial fell to the Raven Guard, whose numbers had been severely depleted following the bloody confrontations on Gate 42, At this time, speculation within the ranks of the Legions Astartes suggested darker motives. Certain Primarchs, primarily led by the thoughts of Petarabo of the Iron Warriors, may have intended to assign the understrength Raven Guard to hazardous missions in order to discredit the Mark V pattern. Some claim that it was meant to be the death nail to the design, ensuring that the heavier pattern would supplant it before it could prove its worth. If it was indeed the plan, it failed spectacularly. As in the verdant seed worlds of the Scaland sector, the Raven Guard displayed a level of mastery that surpassed all expectations. Utilizing the advanced auto senses and enhanced agility of this new power armor in order to execute relentless series of strike and fade operations, hunting Eldari remnants across forest canopies, urban ruins, as their operations left the already weakened Eldari forces fractured, disoriented, and ultimately unable to mount a coordinated defense with their higher levels of technology. The campaign concluded with a complete expulsion of the Eldari from the sector, enabling the Imperium to claim the rich, strategically valuable worlds. In the aftermath, this mark of armor would not only be vindicated, but it would also become enhanced, as the Raven Guard's operational feedback and tactical suggestions were incorporated into the final product. In honor of the Legion's decisive role in the trials, the design was rechristened as the Corvus Pattern Power Armor, also colloquially beloved as the Beaky Armor. Production ramped up on Mars mere solar months before the outbreak of Horus's rebellion, and the armor was redesigned as the Mark VI Corvus Power Armor, integrating stopgap field modifications and repairs accumulated during the Heresy. Earlier sets were retrospectively reclassified as Mark V Heresy Power Armor, reflecting practical adaptations that the Legiones Astartes had made during this long campaign of slaughter and bloodshed. Thus, the Scaland campaign not only marked a military triumph for the Raven Guard, but it also cemented their legacy as trailblazers in technological warfare, ensuring that the 19th Legion's innovations would endure through the coming cataclysm of the Horus Heresy and beyond.